He had assumed that she was just another black woman he could easily intimidate, a notion he clung to until the day she walked into court and shattered his carefully constructed career. That fateful night, the road was nearly empty, with only a few cars passing by. Their headlights danced on the wet pavement as the streetlights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows over the stretch of highway outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was just past 11 o'clock, a time when most people were eager to leave the day behind and return home. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel as if keeping time with a soft jazz tune emanating from her speakers. Renee, not in uniform but wearing only a simple black sweater and jeans with her hair pulled back, did not expect to stand out in any particular way. She was content to blend into the background, humming along to the familiar melody. However, her quiet routine was abruptly interrupted when she noticed the red and blue lights reflecting in her rearview mirror. They were closing in fast. Although her stomach clenched, it was not from fear. She understood the routine all too well. Exhausted after the long drive, she signaled, changed lanes and eased her car onto the shoulder. With deliberate care, she shifted the vehicle into park, took a slow, measured breath, and ensured her hands remained clearly visible on the wheel. Her extensive military experience had taught her exactly what to expect during such encounters. Almost immediately, a white patrol car pulled up directly behind her. The officer inside took his time as he got out, his movements deliberate and imbued with an expectation of immediate obedience. His heavy boots scuffed on the asphalt, one hand firmly resting on his belt while the other held a flashlight that he switched on as he approached. Renee, observing him through the side mirror, noted that the name on his badge caught the light. Briggs. There was no greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat as he presented her with his license and registration. With practiced impatience, Renee met his gaze in the mirror before slowly reaching into her glove compartment to retrieve her documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked in a steady tone. Briggs did not respond immediately. Instead, he took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he gave the car a cursory once-over. "Tail lights out," he said, a statement that caused her to frown in disbelief. "That can't be right," she murmured. At length, Briggs looked at her and asked, "Are you arguing with me?" A heavy silence fell between them, a quiet, unspoken moment in which power clashed with resistance. Each expected the other to yield, a scenario she had seen before during briefings on bases overseas and in training exercises designed to prepare sailors for the unpredictable world outside the Navy. Renee, fully aware of the rules and her rights, replied calmly, "I'm just saying my tail lights were checked a few weeks ago. If there's an issue, I can get it fixed." Before she could finish, Briggs interrupted her with a curt, "Step out of the car," as if her words had never been uttered. With a measured exhale, she glanced at the sparse traffic ahead, no witnesses to vouch for her, and lightly tapped her fingers against the steering wheel. Then, as if compelled by a need to assert her dignity, she reached for the door handle and asked, "Mind telling me why?" Briggs tilted his head, a smirk playing on his lips as he replied, "Because I said so." His tone was dismissive, his authority absolute. For a brief moment, Renee allowed that statement to hang in the air before unbuckling her seatbelt and opening the door. The night air was unexpectedly cool as she stepped onto the pavement. Although her posture was relaxed, it was measured. She was not seeking conflict, yet she refused to be bullied. Briggs, meanwhile, took a step back as if sizing her up, trying to decide just how much he could get away with. "Turn around, hands on the car," he ordered. This time Renee hesitated ever so slightly. Briggs advanced, and with the disappearance of his earlier smirk he demanded, "Are you resisting?" Renee held her ground and calmly answered, "No, I'm asking a question." For a brief moment something flickered across Briggs's face. Perhaps annoyance, perhaps amusement, or even a combination of both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the device, then louder, "Turn around!" Her pulse quickened, yet her expression remained composed. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said in a low, firm voice. "I know exactly what I am allowed to do, and I know exactly what you cannot do." That statement seemed to strike a nerve. Briggs's jaw tensed as he snapped, "You're under arrest!" reaching for her wrist. Reacting quickly, Renee stepped back, narrowly avoiding his grip. "Under arrest for what?" she demanded. Briggs produced a pair of handcuffs, citing that she was obstructing an officer. Renee exhaled sharply through her nose, mentally acknowledging that this was his game. Her military training kicked in, her heart remained steady and her breathing controlled. But in that moment she understood that she had two choices: comply and deal with it later, or push back and risk further escalation. Determined not to become just another statistic, she chose the latter. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the cool metal roof of her car. Before she could protest further, Briggs yanked her arms behind her back and tightened the cuffs excessively, then shoved her roughly toward the patrol car. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured. Briggs chuckled dismissively and shoved her into the back seat of the car. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing," he retorted. He did not even bother closing the hard plastic seat, which dug into her back as she sat motionless, her wrists burning against the unforgiving cuffs. Outside the car, as the door slammed shut with finality, Briggs strutted back to his own vehicle while muttering something into his radio. Renee glanced at the partition that separated her from the front seat. The faint reflection of her face stared back at her, calm and composed on the surface, though simmering with restrained anger beneath. She had endured combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in far-flung hostile territories, yet nothing quite compared to this. A man with a badge, drunk on power, and utterly convinced of his own untouchability. Minutes passed. First a few, then 5, then 10, during which she shifted her hand slightly to test the tightness of the cuffs, a deliberate reminder that he had tightened them on purpose. Then the driver's side door swung open and Briggs slid into the car, whistling, "Well, well." He pulled his seatbelt across his chest and said, "Let's take a little ride." Without waiting for a response, he threw the car into gear and pulled off the shoulder back onto the road. The patrol car lurched forward, its overhead lights still flashing, and the reflection of red and blue danced in the side mirrors, staining the road behind them. After a moment, Briggs remarked, "You know, most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop," she replied silently. Briggs laughed and shook his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody," he said. Renee met his gaze through the glass and responded simply, "I don't think I know." For a fleeting moment, his knuckles flexed around the steering wheel and a flicker of irritation broke through his smug exterior, yet he quickly covered it up with a change in tone. "You're military?" he asked. Renee said nothing. Briggs continued, "Yeah, I figured. You got that attitude, like you're above the law," he smirked. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Still, Renee remained silent. Briggs clicked his tongue in apparent disapproval. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." His words, laced with condescension, only served to tighten her resolve. As the patrol car neared a squat, grey brick building set just off the main road, the mostly empty parking lot testified to the late-night processing, which moved at a sluggish pace. For now, it appeared that she was the only guest. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, "I do love it when they make it easy." Before she could respond, he stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open again as he ordered, "Let's go." Renee twisted her wrist slightly as she stepped out. The cuffs bit into her skin, having not been loosened at all. With her head held high, she allowed Briggs to lead her inside, passing a board-faced desk sergeant and proceeding to the processing area. Inside the holding area, the air reeked of stale coffee and sweat. A metal bench lined one wall, and a steel door led to the cells beyond. Briggs briefly uncuffed her, just long enough to force her through the standard booking procedure. Fingerprints, a mugshot, and a tedious routine carried out with mechanical indifference by the officers behind the desk. This kind of dispassionate treatment was all too familiar to her. It was the same indifference that enabled men like Briggs to thrive unchecked. Once the paperwork was completed, he grabbed her wrist once more and led her toward the cells, muttering under his breath, "You think you're smart, huh?" She glanced sideways and replied quietly, "I don't have to think," knowing full well that his grip had indeed struck a nerve. As his grip tightened, she could sense the growing frustration in his tone. "Enjoy your stay," Briggs sneered, shoving her toward the cell. Renee caught herself before stumbling and, with a steady resolve, watched as the metal bars slid shut between them. Briggs smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place, and she sank onto the cold, unforgiving metal bench. The chill of the metal pressed through her jeans, a stark reminder that sometimes one night's experience was all it took to change everything. Briggs had no inkling of the formidable strength he had provoked. As Renee shifted slightly to roll her shoulders and ease the creeping stiffness, she surveyed the stark, cramped cell. It was little more than 4 bare walls, a single flickering light, and the faint smell of old sweat and disinfectant. A far cry from the harsh environments she had experienced in far worse conditions, where real danger loomed with every moment. Yet, while the conditions were far from ideal, they did nothing to quench the anger that simmered beneath the surface. Through the bars, she could hear the faint murmur of officers at the front desk, the shuffle of paperwork, the occasional clatter of a coffee cup against a desk. She exhaled slowly, steadying her breath and controlling her mind, recalling the basic training drilled into her long before she had ever stepped foot into the fleet. Before long, heavy footsteps announced Briggs's return. She recognized his presence even before he came into view, his stride, that same arrogant rhythm of a man who had long believed himself untouchable, was unmistakable. Within moments, he appeared at the cell door, arms crossed over his chest and the same infuriating smirk plastered on his face. "Comfy?" he asked, his tone mocking. She did not answer. Tilting his head, he stepped closer to the bars and said, "You know, if you had just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." A slow smile curled at the edges of her lips as she replied quietly, "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." For just a moment, Briggs's smirk faltered. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps uncertainty, crossed his eyes before he quickly masked it. Scoffing, he glanced toward the empty holding area and shrugged. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady. I guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude." Renee simply watched him, unmoved and unshaken. Briggs leaned in slightly and continued in a lowered voice. "Here's the thing. People like you think the rules don't apply. You believe a little confidence is enough to get you out of trouble." She let him talk, letting him ramble on, fully aware that he had no idea what was coming next. Almost on cue, another officer, a younger man in his late 20s dressed in standard-issue uniform, approached from the hallway. He stopped a few feet away, holding a clipboard, and said, "Sergeant." His voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Briggs barely glanced at him before the officer hesitated, shifting on his feet. "I think you need to see this," the officer added. Briggs frowned, gave Renee one last scornful look, and then stepped away. Inside the cell, Renee sat back and listened as the conversation grew hushed, catching bits and pieces. Mention of a lawyer, a call from higher up, questions about why she was being held. Briggs' voice had dropped lower, sharper, and laced with annoyance as the younger officer stammered a reply that did little to satisfy him. Soon, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Briggs stormed back toward her cell, his jaw tight and his hands clenched into fists. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded. Leaning forward and resting her elbows on her knees, Renee calmly responded, "I didn't do anything." Her head tilted slightly as she added, "But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places." Briggs's face darkened as he recognized, perhaps for the first time, the shift in power. He turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath as he disappeared down the hallway. Renee exhaled slowly, certain that it wouldn't be long now before the truth came to light, and when it did, Briggs was going to regret every single decision that had led him here. Morning light eventually spilled through the narrow courthouse windows, casting long streaks across the polished floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones if you sat still too long. Standing near the defendant's table, Renee's posture was relaxed, but her eyes were sharp. No longer was she in handcuffs, nor did she wear an orange jumpsuit. Instead, she now sported a well-tailored navy new blazer over a simple blouse, radiating an undeniable presence. And she was not alone. Beside her sat her attorney, Carla Whitman, efficiently flipping through a stack of papers with barely a glance upward as people gradually filled the courtroom. Carla's methodical manner, with no wasted movements or small talk, was exactly the kind of efficiency Renee admired. Just then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Briggs walked in, still carrying himself as if he owned the room, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised. Yet there was now a noticeable stiffness in his step, and a flicker of uncertainty in his expression that had not been there before. He was not as sure of himself anymore. When their eyes met briefly, Renee saw that he looked away quickly, as if chastising himself with a silent, "Good." Moments later, Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression and adjusting his glasses, took his seat. Without wasting time, he said, "All right, let's get to it." Glancing over the case files, he continued with a sigh, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat and stated, "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." A murmur rippled through the room. Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening as the judge peered over his glasses. "Sergeant Briggs, care to explain?" the judge inquired. Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat as he began. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop," the prosecutor immediately interrupted. "Uncooperative?" He then lifted a document from the table, and Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career. A Naval Academy graduate, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all this, you considered her such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken tail light? Briggs opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it, allowing an uncomfortable silence to stretch between them. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. "Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history reveals a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Briggs's face darkened as Judge Kirkland set his file down with a heavy sigh. "Sergeant Briggs, I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs sat back and crossed his arms, while Renee resisted inwardly. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow and said, "The body cam footage says otherwise." At that moment, another ripple of noise moved through the room. Briggs looked at the judge, suddenly more defensive, and said, "I was following standard procedure." But Judge Kirkland was not convinced. He glanced toward the bailiff and said, "Let's play the footage." A screen descended at the front of the courtroom, and a video began to play. Renee did not turn to watch as the familiar images unfolded. Briggs, barking orders, accused her in a calm yet authoritative tone of unnecessary escalation and smug defiance, all while tightening the cuffs with an almost ceremonial flourish. When the footage ended, the courtroom was dead silent. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers, and said, "Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol, conducted an unlawful arrest, and failed to report the full details in your initial statement." Briggs opened his mouth to protest, but the judge continued, "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed, and I strongly suggest an immediate internal investigation into your conduct." His gavel came down sharply and decisively. The tension in the room snapped like a pulled rubber band. Briggs looked as though he had been punched in the gut, his face flushed red and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Meanwhile, Renee exhaled slowly, controlled and resolute, as she gathered her belongings. She glanced at Briggs one last time. There was no need for words. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. In that moment, it was clear that the battle for her reputation was no longer hers alone to fight. Briggs, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished hallways, stormed out of the courtroom. His face remained tight and his jaw clenched as he became acutely aware of the disapproving stares from fellow officers, court staff, and even reporters who had arrived following word of the case. He was unaccustomed to losing control, a control he had always taken for granted. Then came the worst part. A sharp, commanding voice cut through the clamor of the hallway. "Sergeant Briggs," the voice said. Briggs turned to see Chief Eldon Baker standing with his arms crossed. Baker's expression was unreadable. With over 30 years on the force, he was a respected figure whose word carried significant weight. Briggs straightened, and Baker studied him for a moment before, with a curt nod, motioning for him to follow into a private office. Once the door closed behind them, Baker's tone dropped to a quiet but firm reproach. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. Briggs exhaled sharply. "I was doing my job," he replied defensively. Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk so that it landed with a heavy thud. That's not what it looks like from here, Baker continued, his voice low and measured. The body cam footage, your arrest history, and the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting speak volumes, Briggs. What does that have to do with anything? Briggs's nostrils flared as he stuttered a response. Baker leaned forward, his tone quiet but sharp. This wasn't some random woman. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. Do you think this is going to simply disappear? Briggs looked away, grinding his teeth as he attempted to justify himself. She was disrespectful. She questioned you, he offered weakly. Baker cut in. That's not a crime. Briggs scoffed and shook his head. You don't get it, people like that. His voice trailed off as Baker interjected. People like what? Briggs swallowed hard and said nothing. Baker then sighed, rubbing his forehead. The Department of Justice is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you better believe this department is not going to let you continue unchecked. Briggs's stomach twisted at those words. What does that mean? He asked, shakily. Baker straightened up. It means you're being put on immediate suspension effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating you, and if they find what I suspect, your career is over. The words hit Briggs like a punch to the gut. His face burned with shame and disbelief as Baker added, pack up your desk and, if I were you, get yourself a lawyer. Standing there with his fists clenched at his sides, Briggs realized for the first time that he was not untouchable. Across town, in a quiet cafe, Renee stirred her cup of coffee while scrolling through her phone. The case had already made headlines, and the footage had gone viral. The news labeled her as a lieutenant commander who had been wrongfully arrested, a fact that did not surprise her in the least. She had recognized from the moment she was pulled over that this would be her destiny. She had seen men like Briggs before, entitled, arrogant, and used to bending the law in their favor. But this time, he had lost. Her phone buzzed with a message from her attorney. Briggs has been suspended. He might even face charges. Renee took a slow sip of her coffee and looked out the window, watching the city continue its busy rhythm. The fight was far from over, not just for her, but for all the people that Briggs and others like him had hurt over the years. That day, however, marked a significant victory. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Renee stepped out of the cafe. The weight of the previous 24 hours, which should have burdened her, had evaporated. She walked with her usual confidence, head held high and step steady. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she answered a call from a recognized number. A familiar voice greeted her. Captain, Lieutenant Commander. After a brief silence, the captain asked, I assume you've seen the news. How are you feeling? Renee glanced at her reflection in a nearby storefront window. There were no signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do, she replied. The captain's voice softened. That's what I thought you'd say. After a brief pause, he continued. The Department of Defense has taken an interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Renee exhaled slowly. I'm not sure I'm interested in being a headline. The captain countered. You already are. And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something much bigger. Deep down, Renee had always known that Briggs was not an isolated case. He was merely one cog in a much larger system. A system that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for years. This was not solely about her. It was about the dozens, perhaps even hundreds of people who had found themselves in her shoes, lacking the privilege of rank, legal representation, or even the voice to fight back. Leaning against a streetlight and watching the steady flow of traffic, she murmured to herself, this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it surely won't be the last. The captain agreed, emphasizing that while this might be the first time Briggs was facing real consequences, it was only because she had refused to back down. Closing her eyes for a brief moment, Renee allowed the weight of those words to settle in. She had not backed down, not when Briggs had pulled her over, not when he had tried to intimidate her, not when the cuffs had tightened around her wrists, and not even when she had spent the night behind bars, fully aware that the odds were stacked against her. Her resolve had never wavered, and now, as the captain cleared his throat one last time, he added, You might be getting a call from the mayor's office. Renee raised an eyebrow, a small smirk forming on her lips. Oh? Seems they want to recognize me for handling the situation with professionalism and grace, she said, noting the irony in the situation. The captain chuckled lightly. You going to accept it?" She wondered silently for a moment before shrugging. I'll think about it." With that, she ended the call and tucked her phone back into her pocket. Outside, across the street, a mother walked hand in hand with her young son. His small hand was tightly clasped in hers, and he laughed carefree at something only a child could find amusing. Renee paused to watch them for a moment, thinking of the next generation. She had fought not only for herself, but for every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Briggs could no longer wield their badges like weapons. Taking a deep, resolute breath, she turned and walked away, each step firm, each step a declaration of purpose. This fight had never been solely hers. It was a battle against the unchecked abuse of power. For too long, power had been allowed to be abused without accountability. What had happened to her was a reality that unfolded every day for countless others. People without the privilege of rank, connections, or the evidence necessary to defend themselves. It is precisely for that reason that speaking up is so vital. We must demand change and refuse to remain silent. If this story has stirred something in you, if it has made you think, angered you, or opened your eyes to the immense work that lies ahead, then share it, talk about it, engage in real conversations, for it is only through dialogue and collective determination that we can begin to hold the system accountable and see genuine change. Remember, unchecked power is power abused, and every time someone dares to stand up, it is a victory not only for themselves, but for all those who have suffered in silence. As Renee continued her walk, she felt the warmth of the afternoon sun mingling with the cool breeze, a perfect counterpoint to the turbulent events of the previous day. With each confident step, she carried not just her own story, but the hopes of many who had been marginalized and silenced for too long. Her fight was emblematic of a much larger struggle, one that called for systemic change and unwavering courage. And although the road ahead was fraught with challenges, Renee's resolve remained unbroken. Her journey was a testament to the belief that real change starts with the courage to speak out, to stand up, and to insist on accountability in the face of injustice. In the end, what transpired that night and in the courtroom was more than just a personal victory. It was a clarion call to all those who had been wronged, a rallying cry for a future where power was never allowed to be abused, and where every individual, regardless of their background, had the right to be heard and respected. With her head held high and her heart filled with determination, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson became a symbol of resistance and hope. Her story, though born out of conflict and adversity, shone as a beacon of courage, a reminder that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not with weapons, but with integrity, perseverance, and an unyielding sense of justice. And so, as the day unfolded with promise and possibility, Renee walked on. The echoes of that long, turbulent night would remain with her forever, a constant reminder of the sacrifices made and the victories earned through steadfast resistance. Yet, with each step forward, she also carried the hope that her courage would inspire others to rise, to demand accountability, and to ultimately transform a broken system into one that respected and protected the rights of all its citizens. In a world where abuse of power had long been the norm, her unwavering defiance had become a catalyst for change. A small but powerful spark that, if nurtured by many voices, could ignite a movement. Today, the fight was far from over. The struggle for justice, equality, and accountability would continue as long as voices like hers remained unbowed and relentless. And as Renee blended into the bustling crowd on the city streets, her presence, quiet yet formidable, spoke volumes that real change begins when one dares to stand up, even against insurmountable odds. Her footsteps, echoing softly on the pavement, carried not only the weight of her own experiences, but also the aspirations of every individual who had ever been oppressed. In that moment, as the city moved around her, Renee knew that her battle was just one chapter in a much larger story. The story that demanded collective action, persistent advocacy, and the courage to challenge injustice wherever it reared its head. For her, for the countless others who had suffered in silence, and for a future where the badge of authority could never again be wielded as a weapon against the vulnerable, the journey toward true justice had only just begun.